I was thinking over what I was going to make my major points today for a couple of days. I came up with 8 theses, which I will briefly introduce to you as a starting point for our discussion. I believe the most important part would be the conversation after that. Let me begin with the, I agreed with the title which Kadri has suggested to me, Russia and the OSCE-based European order. And this gave me the opportunity to, many of my theses may be provoking enough for the good reason. This is why the beginning, most provoking thesis would be to say that never in the history of the CSC, OSCE was there an OSCE or CSC-based European order. We did have some chances to go in this direction, but we missed all of them. This is not to say that the CSC or the OSCE have been unhelpful or can't be helpful in the future, but of course the CSC or OSCE have not been or will not be at the core of the European order. For an accord or an institution to shape a regional order, you must have at least 3 major ingredients. One is it should provide a regime, a normative basis, the rules which are supposed to be observed by the participating states. Apart from this, and this is something for which the OSCE is very famous, apart from this, the organization or institution or framework need to have a real regulatory power to be able to not simply declare specific norms, but to be able to regulate relations among participating states by various means and ways. And number 3, in order to uphold the established order, regional order, the framework, the institution, the organization must have powers to enforce that order. And that is probably the weakest point in the CSC or OSCE history, because the OSCE is known for the specific category of security organization, which is called cooperative security organizations. And the distinctive feature of cooperative security organizations is that they don't have any enforcement powers. They are fully dependent on the cooperation of the participating states, and if the cooperation is not given, the possibility to really affect the developments on the ground is limited. This is not to say that the OSCE never tried to establish some kind of soft enforcement institutions. One example is I think it was 1993 Rome Convention on the Court of Arbitration or of Conciliation and Arbitration of the OSCE, with a very interesting and innovative feature, because with the political commitments or the alleged breach of political commitments, you cannot go to the international court. And the innovative procedure for the OSCE was to say to the OSCE court, you could go even with alleged breach of political commitments under the OSCE. We know the result of this. There has been no single appeal to the court so far for decades, not least due to the fact that only 35 states out of 57 have adhered to the convention, and most importantly, the big ones like the US or Russia never even considered to join this court. So the normative acquis is very extensive with the OSCE, but the powers to uphold this normative acquis has been always very weak. This is why, and this is my second thesis, since its inception in the 1970s, the CSC, the Helsinki Process, and later on the OSCE was a complement to the existing and then changing and evolving European order, but not the core of that order. If we go back to the Helsinki Final Act, it included a lot of provisions. The most known of them are human rights and humanitarian issues. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this. If you want, we can come back to this. But if you go to the principles or general statements under the Helsinki Final Act, you may find traces of a very, very controversial debate within the group of 35 countries which negotiated the Helsinki Final Act, as well as within the Soviet bloc at that time. The reference to the indivisibility of security, it was coming first in the Helsinki Final Act. It was very strongly promoted by Romania at that time, with a very clear meaning, which has changed over time, but at that time the meaning was indivisibility of security meant that all the principles of the Helsinki Final Act would apply in relations between all of the member states. Essentially, this meant that this would be extended to the Soviet bloc as well, challenging the Brezhnev doctrine, which got institutionalized at that time, or the freedom of choice of alliances, which is also in the Helsinki Final Act, promoted strongly at that time by Romania and France together during the negotiations in Geneva, which was reflecting also the difficult relations within the alliances at that time. Effectively, this could mean that every member of the Warsaw Pact would be free to choose whether to stay in the alliance or to leave it or to join another alliance. Of course, at the rest of the Cold War period of time, until 1989, effectively, when Gorbachev in July 1989, speaking at the Council of Europe for the first time, publicly denounced the Brezhnev doctrine, not speaking of the Brezhnev doctrine, but shaping this in a different language. Until that time, nobody would believe that this provision of the Helsinki Final Act could be really activated and implemented by eventual candidates for leaving either the Warsaw Pact. It would be easier with NATO, not very easy, but it would be easier with NATO. In other words, the Helsinki Final Act, already the Helsinki Final Act had set up the plank or the bar of the normative demands very high, but it would take decades for many of these appeals to materialize. And the order, the European order, was still determined until the end of the Cold War by the Yalta Order, the division of Europe and the division of Germany, beginning to erode only in 1989. The Helsinki Final Act, the Helsinki Process were helpful to stabilize the situation in the Cold War in Europe, but it did not replace the Yalta Order, which still dominated and dictated the way things were evolving. Number three, this is not to say that the Helsinki Process did not have any effect. It had many effects on the situation in East-West relations, as well as in the East in particular. Beginning with the very fact that it was inspiring many in the Eastern Bloc to consolidate the dissidents movement and to form Helsinki groups which claimed their right under the Helsinki Final Act, and the principle of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, Principle 7 of the Helsinki Final Act, became a reference point for these movements. Something which was very much to the surprise of many Western countries, which insisted on the inclusion of the principle and on the more specific provisions in the third basket of the Helsinki Final Act. Of course, over the time, the Helsinki Process developed several tools of seeking to increase the impact of the Helsinki Accords on the policies of the participating states. One of them, and I believe one of the most important tools, was setting up the process in form of follow-up meetings. And follow-up meetings were focused, and this is based on the provisions of the Helsinki Final Act, on two issues. Number one would be to have a discussion on how the provisions of the Helsinki Final Act are implemented, which, as we know, has led in the late 1970s and early 1980s to the very controversial debate, also flowing into the public space, but coming back at every next follow-up meeting to review how the states have implemented their commitments under the Helsinki Final Act was an important element of keeping states accountable to the way they lived up or did not live up to the promises under the Helsinki Process. But no less important was the second part of the mandate for the follow-up meetings, that was considering further proposals for taking the Helsinki Process to the next steps. And that played an increasingly important role during the Helsinki process. Just to give you one example, and I think this is important for our contemporary discussions. In the Helsinki Final Act, in the third baskets, the participating states agreed to benevolently treat applications for emigration, for family reunification or immigration, etc., etc. And for the first follow-up meeting in Belgrade in 1977, which lasted through spring 1978, the Soviet Union and other Soviet bloc countries came with self-reports, reporting some improvements which were real, reporting increased numbers of travel, including private travel, reporting about increased numbers of immigrants, reporting on the positive changes in the procedures for treating the applications. From the position of the Western countries, it was not sufficiently meeting the commitments under the Helsinki Final Act. And after a very controversial debate, which did not result in any decisions in Belgrade, but did result in some decisions taken in Madrid at the next follow-up meeting, which ended in 1983. The policy was very simple. After a very controversial debate on the implementation record, proposals introduced were focused on specifying in greater detail the commitments which were achieved in Helsinki. And for instance, with the mentioned example, benevolently treating the applications for immigration, the proposals, and some of them were adopted in Madrid, we're looking forward to specify what it would mean. What does benevolently mean? And the proposals went ahead to specify that this would mean that applications would not be considered longer than a specific period of time, like 2 weeks, no longer than 2 weeks. People should receive a response within 2 weeks. As a rule, the decisions should be positive, allowing for travel. And the fees charged for the permit to emigrate would not exceed a specific amount of weekly wages, average weekly wages in a specific country, etc. So setting, if you have a controversial case, you set more specific criteria, which would be helpful to more clearly judge whether you are within the implementation of the specific commitments or whether you are not. So these mechanisms were working increasingly well, although the Helsinki process went through various crises, and at some points in time, there was a very strong feeling, particularly in the West, that it was of no help. One episode right before the change in the CSC policy of the Soviet Union and a few countries in the Soviet bloc, the US was considering to withdraw from the Helsinki process, with a basic appeal saying, okay, we did have the promises on human rights, we did have the promises in the third basket, the Soviet bloc did not deliver sufficiently, and the whole Helsinki process did not help us at all to change the policies of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet bloc countries. With the crash on the dissidents, with the crash on the Helsinki groups, many of the people who were sent to jail to psychiatric treatment, etc., etc. So there was a growing frustration with the outcome from the Helsinki process by the beginning of the Vienna follow-up meeting in 1986. It is important to note that it was the Helsinki Commission of the US which defended the Helsinki Final Act with a very clear sign that the Helsinki process gives us a chance to try to have an impact on the Soviet policies. If we quit, we don't have a chance to have an impact on the Soviet policies to this or that effect. And that was an important part of the story, but also revealing that the regulative power of the CSC was fairly weak from the very beginning. It began changing only in the late 1980s with the advent of Gorbachev, but not the very first day of the advent of Gorbachev either. So my point here would be to conclude to say that the collapse of the Yalta Order, the collapse of the communism in Europe, and the changes which we have witnessed in 1989, 1990, were not happening because of the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process has assisted these changes very much, has helped very much to shape the process in a peaceful way, but it was not because of the of the order established in Helsinki in 1975 that the communism in Europe had collapsed in 1989 and 1990. It was the effect of very, very complex processes. My number 4 is we did have a hope. This may have been a romantic period for the CSC development. We did have a hope in the period of 1989, 1990, and several years thereafter that the CSC can really become a centerpiece of a new European order which would emerge after the collapse of the Yalta order in Europe. And this is exactly the time where some of the best documents in the history of the CSC, OSCE have been adopted. I'm still very much proud to have been part of the drafting of exactly those documents: the Vienna follow-up meeting 1989, the Copenhagen document 1990, the Charter of Paris, and the Moscow document of 1991. So this was a golden romantic era of the OSCE. And of course, many hopes were linked to the pursuit of the promise of the Charter of Paris of 1990. And this is very often referred to in the current conversations as well. This is an important point to clarify some critical points which are raised in Russia in this respect. I may not necessarily share these critical points, but it is important to understand this critique against the backdrop of the hopes which existed in the early 1990s. The Charter of Paris had promised two things. One was finally establishing a platform of shared values, which included three components, which are spelled out in the first part of the Charter of Paris. Number one was a commitment to the democracy as a single way of government in the countries based on political pluralism and the rule of law. Second, prosperity based on economic freedom and social responsibility. Essentially, this meant the social-oriented market economy. And number three, common security for all participating states of the OSCE. The second promise of the Charter of Paris was to begin developing pan-European institutions, which were expected to lead toward establishing some kind of, as people would call, European collective security order in Europe based on pan-European institutions, and progressively leading toward the transformation of the alliances, politicization of the alliances, something which was a major talk in 1990, both in the Warsaw Pact and in NATO, and finally dissolving the alliances in the pan-European system of relations. This was an utopia. It was becoming increasingly clear already at that time, but that was the prospect. The Charter of Paris did not establish those permanent institutions. It was paving the way for the discussion, and the major decisions in that direction were taken in 1992 by the Helsinki summit meeting of the CS, at that time yet the CSCE. But that was a basic promise. The important part here is when in the West now the discussion goes back to the Charter of Paris, emphasizes human rights, political pluralism, rule of law aspect of as part of the common normative acquis. When this is very much true, and this was very much confirmed by every single following summit meeting by the OSCE, including the Astana summit meeting in 2010. But the package expected, and that was the first issue, the package expected in Moscow was not reduced to the human rights or rule of law aspect of the OSCE acquis, but was seen as a complex deal, if you wish, that would include not only the rule of law aspects, not only the human dimension, but also the security relevant dimension of the OSCE. And the following developments, as interpreted now in Moscow, would imply that while continuously insisting on the human dimension part of the OSCE acquis, the OSCE, and not only the OSCE, but the way the European order was evolving, was increasingly abandoning the security element of that package. It is not exactly correctly, but but that's a predominant view, by neglecting the security element of the initial thinking from the Charter of Paris that was ruining the basis for the consensus that was established in 1990 and in the early 1990s. This brings me to the next point, fifth point, and I need to accelerate. The basic change was coming with the beginning of, it was not yet a dramatic change. And I must say, I myself was very critical of the ability of the CSC of having a decisive impact on the formation of the European order after the Cold War. And I'm on the record in my publications already in 1990, when I began speaking of the beginning marginalization of the CSC, favoring rather the NATO and the European communities at that time, their consolidation and further enlargement. But Russia was a champion of the CSC for the first half of the 1990s, coming up with very ambitious proposals. I was at that time also fairly critical of the ambition, but seeking to establish the CSC as the central European institutions. And that was in conformity with the language, let's say, of the Helsinki decisions of 1992, so thinking of the OSCE, of the CSC to play a central role in managing change in Europe, or the Charter of European Security of 1999, suggesting a central role for the OSCE in the European order. That was changing with the beginning of the process of enlarging the European Union and NATO, for a very simple reason that Moscow would, and the problem for Moscow was formulated by Andrey Zagorsky in one of his programmatic articles in 1994, when, among other things, he identified what he called the institutional gap. His point was to say it is crucial for Russia, which wanted at that time to become part of the political West. The institutional solutions could be different, but his point was to say we are permanent member of the UN Security Council, so we are fully involved in decision making there. We are in the CSCE, later OSCE, fully involved in the process of decision making. Not a single decision can be taken bypassing the Russian Federation, but there are other centers of decision making which don't include the Russian Federation. He particularly mentioned two of them, the G7 at that time and NATO. When the focus of the European order began shifting towards or reducing options like the OSCE being central to the European order, and began shifting towards developing what is called a NATO and the EU-centric European order, and that was the effect of the enlargements. This was not immediately alienating Russia from that development, but that was changing the focus of the Russian policy as well. Once you note that the European order becomes more NATO and EU-centric, no longer giving a hope to make the OSCE to a central institution in that order, you shift the focus of your policy, and the policy of Russia from 1995 onwards, and I would say even from 1994, was focused on seeking to identify options and develop institutions with both NATO and then increasingly European Union, particularly since the 2000s, when the formation of the EU tools for the common defense and security and defense policy began, developing procedures and institutions for joint decision-making and joint action. And that was happening also at the expense of the focus on the OSCE. So Russia was following the change, being unable to affect, to influence these developments. So I will skip a few points. An important change was coming sometime in the mid of 2000s. I think we cannot figure out a particular date for the change to be completed. It was a chain of events and decisions, initially not strategic ones, but as they accumulated, they resulted in important decisions. and important effects. But I think in the relationship with the OSCE, one important moment was the Russian parliamentary election in late 2003. In my judgment, that was the beginning of the growing gap between Russia and the West. Not immediately, not huge immediately, but that was the turning point. And one of the elements, one of the moments in this development was related to the OSCE when the ODIHR observation mission came out. Well, the language was different, was more delicate, but essentially the ODIHR observation mission was coming out with the conclusion that the elections, parliamentary elections in Russia were free but not fair. And that was the beginning point of the alienation after Putin reacted to the ODIHR statement saying they should teach their wife how to cook the shi. Shi is a traditional Russian cabbage soup based on meat broth. And that was one of the first steps in the process of alienation, which resulted already by 2005 in a very clear critique from Russia on the OSCE. And the critique was based on the conclusion that the OSCE was captured by the West. This ran around the Orange Revolutions, whatever events, but the conclusion was the OSCE was captured by the West. It was becoming simply an instrument in the pursuit of Western policy at the expense of the interests of the Russian Federation. I do recall in 2005, and 2004 was the beginning of the controversy on the future of the OSCE with the hard critique from Russia and CSTO member states. And this was a reason for the OSCE to set up the first panel of eminent persons, which was supposed to develop suggestions of how to diffuse the tension. I was invited as an expert to brief the panel at some point in time. And in the discussion we had, I heard, I heard this many times back in Moscow. I heard this for the first time in that kind of settings of the eminent persons when Nikolai Afanasievsky, who was the first representative of Russia on that panel, was very clearly, bluntly saying the OSCE is captured by the West. The conclusion Moscow made out of this was double capture. And this is not the way out, but the conclusion was not, in order not to allow the OSCE to function as an instrument of purely Western policy, we need to double capture this. And this was the beginning of a series of proposals from the Russian side under the general heading of an OSCE reform. And we have not still transcended this period of discussions. And that was demanding to curb the autonomy of existing OSCE institutions like ODIHR, like the High Commissioner, less the High Commissioner, more about the field missions of the OSCE, and to strictly bind any move on the OSCE to the consensus decision to be taken by the Permanent Council. And this has led us to the current statement. The dispute over autonomy, more autonomy or less autonomy, resulted and manifested itself in different ways. During the Corfu process, there was a big dispute about whether or not to grant any of the OSCE institutions, like the chairman in person or the Secretary General, with the right to act quickly in terms of a crisis without waiting for a consensus in the Permanent Council. And we are still within that stalemate, although after 2014 we don't have much of discussions of that sort. So to finalize, because I'm running out of my time, where are we now? I don't take the whole hold on the conversations now. The OSCE is somewhat, to some extent, back in the field. This is due to the Ukraine crisis. If I look at the numbers and at the budgets, at the beginning of the 2000s, 2/3 of the budget of the field missions of the OSCE was spent on Southeastern Europe. Russia resisted any expansion of OSCE activities to the post-Soviet space. Today, due to Ukraine engagement of the OSCE, 2/3 of the OSCE budget on the field operations is spent on Ukraine. It's SMM. And the same goes for the personnel. So the focus has shifted for obvious reasons. And with the revival of some kind of bipolar Russia-West confrontation, the OSCE is back into play as an institution which helps to, at this moment in time, which helps to reduce the damage from the current crisis. The OSCE would be, in very brief terms, the OSCE would be, whenever we begin considering how we get out of the current crisis, the OSCE would be an important part of the solution, but not the single solution, because we cannot ignore the other dimensions like the Russia-NATO relationships and its future, or Russia-EU relationship in various instances. But the OSCE could play a very important role, like it did in the 1970s and the 1980s. And here, coming back to the same logic, which I have mentioned before, if we have a dispute over the way we understand and interpret the normative basis of the OSCE, the way out is not to seek who is right, who is wrong. I don't believe, we may have our own opinions on this. I do have mine. But the way out would not be to come to the final conclusion who is right, who is wrong. The way out will be in specifying the way to understand these norms. And I see here at least two major dimensions. There would be more, but I reduce myself to two major issues. Can we reconcile the different visions for the European security in Russia and in the West? So the West, and this is something which has been stated as non-negotiable on the Western side, the freedom of choice of the alliances. Okay, Russia emphasizes a different aspect, its current interpretation of indivisibility of security, and that goes back to one of the elements of the code of conduct adopted by the OSCE in 1994 on military political cooperation. And that goes to say, yes, every participating state has a freedom of choice of alliances, but while exercising this freedom, everyone has to take into account the legitimate security concerns of others. How can we bring this to very diverging interpretations of where we are to a common denominator? The second is, and this is particularly important against the backdrop of the debates of the last years over the hybrid warfare, etc. Hybrid warfare well, there's a lot of dispute about the term itself, but hybrid warfare refers to various forms of eventual interference into internal affairs below the level of military hostilities. So for me, most of the debate of the hybrid warfare would fall under the non-interference principle, and revisiting the non-interference principle and seeing where we can move in more detailed understanding of what is not allowed under non-interference premise would be an important element of seeking a way out of the contemporary crisis in a more constructive way of specifying the commitments and specifying the acquis, but not having a hope that the OSCE will develop a really regulatory power based on enforcement capabilities. In this respect, we are back in a different kind of order, which is based on alliance politics.